This is the Stephen Mansfield Podcast.
Welcome to the Stephen Mansfield Podcast, the podcast where we look at our generation through the lens of faith and leadership, character, and history. Great to have you with me here on the Stephen Mansfield Podcast. Hey, let me just say real quickly before I dive into our topic for this episode that we are looking for sponsors for the Stephen Mansfield Podcast. We've got some folks circling. We're excited about that. If you, your company, an entity that you're involved in would like to sponsor this podcast, we'd love to have a number of good sponsors. Help us with what we do. We'll promote you. It'll be a great relationship. So contact us through stephenmansfield.tv. I want to dive into this topic, and I got to tell you, I'm feeling a little bit of fire and a little bit of anger, so hang with me in this podcast as we deal with something that is troubling. If you've been with me for a while, you know that on any given podcast, you can find me pretty happy with Donald Trump and then pretty upset with Donald Trump at other times. And some people are confused by that. Well, I think that's where being a Christian and a classical conservative lands me. I'm not a neocon. I'm not in some of the newer, trendier versions of conservatism. I'm an old school, traditional values, prior even to the founding fathers, conservative in the old school mold. Burke and the Boys, all of the classics, that's where I am. Therefore, I'm often out of sync with conservatism in our generation. And one of the things that has really had me out of sync, I've addressed many times on this podcast, and that is the contemporary GOP, the contemporary Republican/conservative movement, has virtually been in bed with Vladimir Putin and with Russia. I want to say very quickly, I love the Russian people. I love the Russian land and geography. I love Russian history. I've traveled extensively in that part of the world. Everything I'm about to say is about its government and about Putin, not about the people whom I love. However, the modern conservative movement, led specifically by Trump and with many of the media luminaries who tend to inform it, have been absolutely enamored, I think almost bewitched by Putin and by the Russian government, to the point that they have betrayed allies, to the point that they have almost at times sounded like neo-Marxists, ridiculous reciting of Russian thinking, and just been ridiculous. And you know what I think about this. I'm not going to develop it a whole lot because I've talked about this before in my podcast, but you know that I believe that Donald Trump, in fact, it's not a matter of my belief, it's a matter of actual fact. Donald Trump, in some speeches and some press interviews on some days, has echoed specific language from Russian talking points. We can actually look at the Russian disinformation services, hear what they're saying, almost be able to envision the documents they're working from, and Trump, either consciously or unconsciously, by the end of the day, would be citing their language, their insults of Vladimir Zelensky, president of Ukraine, their perspectives on the war. It was as though at times the White House, and Trump in specific, was a voice for Putin's regime. And the conservative media didn't provide any counterbalance. Many of you saw Tucker Carlson's interview with Putin. What a love fest, letting the man rant on for many, many minutes at a time, let him say ridiculous things that should have been challenged, let him rewrite history, no journalism, no fact-checking, no confrontation, no, if I may say it, courage. And I like Tucker Carlson overall, but that interview was an embarrassment. And so time and again, this has happened. And by the way, the moment that this was the most ridiculous was on February 28th, when Vladimir Zelensky visited Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, vice president, at the White House in the Oval Office. And it was a setup. It was an ambush. From the moment Zelensky got out of his limo, Trump was insulting him, speaking ill of him, putting him down. And they sat there and beat up on him in front of the world press. It was scripted. It was intentional. intentional, it was vicious, and I don't know of another moment like it. Certainly presidents have slapped foreign leaders around overseas and in the White House, but never in front of the press and never as embarrassingly as February the 28th, a day I think should live in infamy. Okay, you can hear the heat coming from me, but here's what's bugging me. Recently, Donald Trump, who campaigned on the idea that the war in Ukraine would never have happened had he been president, said that he could solve and bring about a peace deal pretty quickly once he got in office. So once he got in office, he got after it, thinking that he's the king of the art of the deal. He met Russians in Saudi Arabia without Vladimir Zelensky present and began to negotiate a deal. Again, quite a bit of arrogance. And you know that I think Trump's done some good things and is trying to do some good things domestically, but on international affairs, he is often just bumbling and idiotic. I'm sorry to say it, but that it's just true. And so here he is trying to negotiate a peace deal. He's doing it without Zelensky, which of course only diminishes him and the Ukrainian cause. And Putin, of course, got this sly smile on his face, letting Trump think that he's the master deal maker. But late this past week and over the weekend, Putin showed us who he really is. He launched the largest single aerial attack in the entire war so far. He dispatched more than 69 ballistic missiles, 298 attack drones, and we now know that he's preparing 50,000 Russian troops for an advance. When Donald Trump, who spoke this weekend at West Point on Saturday morning and then was making his way back to Washington, learned of this and then was asked what he thought, he was quite critical of Putin. He said he's gone crazy. He said Putin's gone crazy and lost his mind. Well, Putin didn't back off and say, oh my gosh, I'm sorry I upset my friend or something silly like that. We all would have known it wasn't sincere, but he didn't do that. He said, no, I think the stress is getting to Donald Trump. I think his mind is addled by the pressure he's under. So Putin was insulting about Trump. And Trump, I think, should be in the White House right now with his tail between his legs because he has been shown to be foolish and a pawn of Putin's. In fact, the entire conservative movement, except for those who have broken from the ranks and sounded out, frankly, are looking pretty stupid right now. You know, there's a phrase attributed to Lenin, one of the communist leaders, and it was the phrase useful idiots. And it was the idea that there are people who are idiots. They don't know what they're doing, but they've gotten emotionally attached to communism. And Lenin was saying, we can use them. They're idiots. And we can't trust them. We're not going to involve them internally with us, but we can use them. And this is the same guy who said the West is going to sell us the rope to hang them with. So there's a tradition of Russian leadership, and again, I love the Russian people, but the Russian leadership, there's a tradition of Russian leadership laughing at the West, using them, seeing them as useful idiots, seeing them as people who will sell them the very things they'll use to destroy us. And I got to tell you, the facts are in. If you're a conservative and you're listening to this, in fact, if you're anybody and you're listening to this and you've been pro-Russian and you've bought into Tucker Carlson's silliness and you've bought into Trump's proclamations and you've bought into Trump, acting like he can control Putin. And by the way, I need to say, a man I admire far more than I admire Trump, George W. Bush. He said silly things too. He said he looked into Putin's eyes and saw that he could trust him. I mean, this kind of thing is silly. And when American conservatives go weak at the knees over the dictatorial Russian leadership, it's just foolish. Well, the facts are in. While Trump is praising Putin, trying to negotiate a peace deal without Putin's enemy in the room, and leaning in Russia's direction regarding the negotiations, what does Putin do? He unleashes the largest aerial attack in the entire history of the war. By the way, this is not Stephen's opinion. I'm not a military arms specialist. This is the opinion of the Pentagon. This is the opinion of the military press. So here we are with Donald Trump having made, tremendous claims. And we've just had the worst attack on Ukraine that we've had in the entire war. And I need to say real quickly that, part of the issue here, part of the issue that you need to keep in your mind is that when Putin agrees or approves an attack on Ukraine, it's not on military installations, it's on civilians. The people who died, the buildings that get destroyed, they're civilian places, they're orphanages, they're shopping malls, they're grocery stores, they're apartment complexes, they're schools. This has been proven over and over and over again. If you think I'm making this up, look it up. I try hard to never come to this podcast without the facts, and these facts are verified. So it's time for the conservative movement in America to shake out of its Russophilia, its affinity for Russia. And I understand it a little bit. Russia feigns being Christian. It feigns being a version of Orthodox that some people respect. It feigns masculinity. It outlaws homosexuality. It outlaws transgender. It seems conservative. It seems moral. It seems Christian. And whatever virtue there might be to some of their higher and loftier principles, they're not living them out. They're not living them out. And for those of us who are committed to the historic just war theory that there are principles that should govern the conduct of nations at war so that civilian populations aren't devastated and more damage done than is just, and there's proportionality to it, you cannot praise Russia. You cannot praise Putin's conduct and his government's conduct in this war. I'm not going to say that Zelensky, whom I admire very much, is perfect. I'm not going to say that Ukraine has always been perfect. But they did not launch this war. They did not create this war. And they are trying to bring a just end to this war. And that's very obvious. And the Trump administration's conduct in this has been dishonorable, un-American, and foolish. So I strongly urge you to influence your congressmen, your senators. I strongly urge you, those of you who are in office, to rethink this. This is not historic conservatism. Putin is not a good Christian conservative leader, like I've heard some people say behind the scenes in D.C., and we are being played as fools. And Putin is ramping up. He may sense that the end is coming to the war, and he wants to grab a bunch of territory. That may be what he's thinking. God knows I don't know what he's thinking. But his conduct is definitely a ratcheting up of the war. It's time for us to wake up. It's time for conservatives to stop tolerating Donald Trump taking us in this direction. And it's time for us to realize who Vladimir Putin is. And by the way, the people who are showing themselves wise and noble, quite frankly, are the European leaders, whom some of you have heard me criticize in past podcasts because they were dithering and over-deferring and couldn't pull it together and suspicious of arms. Now they're arming themselves. Now they're banding together. Now they're realizing that they've got to resist Putin, even if Trump has gone weak at the knees. We got to be smart. We got to be aggressive. We've got to take a stand and stop being played by Vladimir Putin.
Stephen Mansfield is a New York Times best-selling author, a popular speaker, and a frequent faith and culture commentator in international media. His groundbreaking books on faith and society include The Faith of George W. Bush, The Search for God in Guinness, Mansfield's Book of Manly Men, and Lincoln's Battle with God. Learn more at stephenmansfield.tv.